Well, hi, everyone, and welcome again to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an on-air personality, a news anchor, and even a TV weatherman.
And John has been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives, difference makers who've really made a difference. We want to welcome a special guest to the Musical Innertube, David Zucchino, a contributing writer for the New York Times. He's been a foreign and national correspondent for the LA Times, and for many years, he was a foreign bureau chief and reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he and I said hello in the halls a few times. He's here today mainly to talk about his nonfiction book, Wilmington's Lie, about an actual, you'd have to say, a terrorist overthrow of a government by Americans in America. And we will we'll find out more about that in a minute. It's pretty much the only time it actually happened quite the way that it did. But it really, it's been almost permanent in many ways, and a great book. And we want to recommend it, especially because it won David his second Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. And David's been up 4 times for the Pulitzer, but he's only won 2. But we're having him on the show anyway. David, welcome to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, good to be with you, John. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Let me open the questioning by asking you. Now, I sort of, being an overeducated guy, I knew about the Wilmington uprising by several names. I'd come across it here and there. Most people have never heard of it, and I'm wondering how you heard of it.
Well, I went to high school and college in North Carolina, and I never heard about it. I was a history buff. I took lots of history courses, and no one ever mentioned it. And this is, again, in the state of North Carolina. I did not hear about it until 1998. Which was the 100th anniversary. And I read some newspaper coverage in Wilmington, North Carolina, about centennial events. The University of North Carolina at Wilmington was trying to bring the descendants together and trying to just bring the whole town together and really look at the real history of what had happened. So that was my introduction, and my response was one, like, how could I not have known about this? How could I be so ignorant? And secondly, the more I learned about it, my reaction was, how could this have possibly happened in the United States?
Could you tell us a little bit about what did happen in Wilmington at that time?
Yeah, Wilmington in 1898 was a very, very unusual city. It was an outlier among southern cities. First of all, it had a black majority, which was almost unheard of in the South. Very few cities had black majorities. Wilmington was 56% black. But more significantly, it had a multiracial government, which was, again, very rare among southern cities. It had a combination of black Republicans and white populists who had, for various reasons that are too complex to go into now, had come together against the white supremacists of the Democratic Party and formed something called Fusion. And they took over the Wilmington city government in 1897. And 2 years earlier, they'd taken over the North Carolina legislature from the white supremacist Democrats. So that created a condition, an intolerable condition for the white supremacists who had been used to running Wilmington since the end of Reconstruction through the help of the KKK and intimidation and murder. They had taken power back after the Civil War, but lost it to this fusion movement. What was interesting about Wilmington, they had many, many black men in positions of leadership, both elected and appointed office. 3 of the 10 aldermen were black men. 10 of the 26 policemen were black men, which was quite unusual. There was a thriving black middle class and a black professional class of doctors, lawyers, and teachers. So this, for the South at that time, was a very unusual situation. Again, this was a situation that was intolerable to the white supremacists, and they decided to do something about it. They announced it well beforehand in the spring and summer of 1898, which was a midterm election year. They said they were going to take the election or remove the multiracial government by the ballot or the bullet or both. And they succeeded. They stole the election through intimidation and ballot stuffing. And then 2 days later, as planned, during the entire summer, they rose up, killed at least 60 black men in the street, and at gunpoint removed the government and appointed the coup leaders in their place.
It's so amazing to hear that. I've read your book a couple of times, and I'm having just hearing you recount this. I'm still having that same response that you say you had when you first started to learn about this. How could such a thing happen? And I'm sure there's all sorts of things that made it possible. Certainly, it seemed as though they had the guns and they had the weapons and they had the support. But I also think, and your book makes this very, very clear. They had the newspaper and the political cartoon. Can you and you talk about the role of these media in spreading lies and hatred and fear?
As you said, they had the leading media of the day, which were newspapers. That's how people got their news back then. And they controlled the leading white supremacist newspaper, the leading newspaper in the entire state, the News and Observer in Raleigh, which is still published today, which is a very liberal paper today. But back then it was what its publisher called the Militant Voice of White Supremacy. The publisher was a well-known figure, Josephus Daniels, who was a member of the executive committee of the Democratic Party and held Democratic Party meetings in his newspaper office. So he made no pretense of being an independent journalist. He was a voice, an advocate for white supremacy. And throughout the spring and summer of 1898, they published a string of phony, just made up stories. One about what the newspaper called the Black Beast Rapist. They printed all these stories trying to terrify white voters that there was a rape epidemic that summer. There was not, but they reported that there was, and that every black man was a Black Beast rapist on the prowl for white women. And they played up any casual contact between a black man and a white woman as a rape or a potential rape. Basically trying to inflame white voters. And that was the perfect way to do it because of the sexual insecurities of white Southern males after the Civil War, and with the rise of the black voter and black men in public office was a direct threat to white supremacy.
Sure.
So the newspaper, the other part of their propaganda was to portray black men as ignorant, incompetent, incapable of governing, and if they were in office, that they were all corrupt, and the government in Wilmington was completely corrupt. So they planted phony stories telling white voters they had to remove this corrupt, when they called it Negro rule and Negro domination, even though there were relatively few black Republicans. There were many, many more white Republicans and white populists in office than there were blacks, but they portrayed it as a rising, basically black revolution. And the third lie was that they were planning a race riot, a black race riot, that they were stockpiling weapons, when in fact it was the whites, as the book points out, who were actually stockpiling the weapons and were planning a coup and had announced it beforehand.
Now, you just explained the lie behind the title of your book, Wilmington's Lie. The biggest one of which was that it was a black uprising that the white people put down. But they got a lot of traction with that, even outside of North Carolina, in some of the northern states. As your book recounts, when the time came for a investigation into the riot, a lot of northern newspapers backed their claim that black people were too ignorant to govern themselves, and other claims that were made.
That was one of the biggest shocks of the research I did for this book. I read a lot of newspapers, a lot of white supremacist Southern newspapers, but because this event was announced beforehand by the white supremacists, all the major white newspapers of the day, and of course the dominant media was white, sent their male reporters down to Wilmington to cover what they called the race war. And this was before the coup. And it was the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, on and on. And when they got to town, they were met by the white supremacist leaders at the train station, and they arranged for their lodging and gave them whiskey and cigars, and they, quote, embedded them, what we today would call embedded them. They assigned reporters to certain white vigilante units who took them around town and fed them the lie that the black men were plotting a race riot and that they were raping white women, fed them the whole lie. And that was the story Northern readers got. I had assumed the Northern press would report independently. They did not. They completely swallowed the story. And part of the story, as you mentioned, was that black men were too incompetent, not only to vote, but to hold public office. And the newspaper reporters bought that hook, line, and sinker. And of all the hundreds of articles that I read, I did not find one instance in which a white reporter interviewed a black man. Every single person they interviewed was a white supremacist. So that to me was astonishing. And even the editorial pages after the coup, if you could boil down their message, it was, well, this was unfortunate, and it's unfortunate that people died and that violence was required, but something had to be done about this Negro domination. And several Northern newspapers on their editorial pages said it had been a huge mistake to give the black man the vote because they weren't ready yet and they weren't educated or intelligent enough to vote, or much less hold public office.
This is a especially pernicious circular argument, since basically the argument is, well, they lost, so they weren't competent to govern.
There you go.
This proves our point. We beat them. I want to ask about the images that were put on the pages of the opinion sections of the newspaper, because images of black people were also used to stoke fear, and it's pretty horrible stuff.
Yeah, and that was a brilliant move by Josephus Daniels. He was well aware that almost 25% of the white population was illiterate. So they weren't reading these stories about black beast rapists, but he took care of that. He hired a cartoonist, and this cartoonist drew these cartoons that portrayed black men as apes, monsters, vampires, beasts. It actually showed them with long fingernails, hairy arms, grasping at fleeing white women. So it was not very subtle, but they were horrific cartoons. We've reprinted some of them in the book. They had a tremendous effect, not only on the illiterate whites, but on literate. It was a very emotional message and a very direct, simple, straight to the gut message that these black beasts are dangerous and we have to remove them. And if it takes violence, that's what it's going to take. And that was essentially the written message, but the visual message was even more powerful, I think.
It's a sorry situation that we could say things haven't changed all that much since the Wilmington uprising. But one thing that has changed, and you mentioned it earlier, you said the Wilmington newspaper at the time was very white, racist, and now it's a very liberal newspaper. But the switch in Democratic and Republican outlooks as well. All of the white racists were Democrat, and all of the people who were more for mixed race were Republican, and that seems to have switched over the years. How exactly did that happen?
That happened in the 1950s with the rise of the civil rights movement. There had been a wing of the Democratic Party as it became more liberal. These were the Dixiecrats. The Southern Democrats were the white supremacists and the segregationist wing of the party, just with the rise of civil rights. And they saw the possibility of civil rights and voting rights legislation coming, and they wanted to stop it. And they knew they could not do it by remaining in the Democratic Party, which had shifted as far as the black vote as well. African Americans were abandoning the Republican Party as it became more conservative and moved to the Democratic Party as the party of civil rights. So all the Dixiecrats and the segregationists moved over to the Republican Party. And by probably the mid 60s, that shift had taken place. And you have, as far as Republicans and Democrats and where the black vote is and where the white nationalists are.
Yeah, I realize that this uprising was very carefully organized. You have, in fact, you wanted to talk about the military militia element. So there was, that indicates, and there's a couple of things to say about it, but I would love to hear more about who these men were. Were they all veterans of the Civil War? And how did they sort of assemble the militia that won them the grand victory?
Right. Well, there were actually several forms. One were the white vigilantes, and they were known as red shirts. They wore red jackets. And there's a very many theories behind that. One is it was from the Scottish Highlanders who wore red jackets to represent the blood that in battle. And most of the immigrants to the Cape Fear region were Scots-Irish. That may have been, but for whatever the reason, they became the red shirts, and they were the vigilantes of the white supremacist movement. But there were also individuals, just individuals with guns, who came out on the day of the coup. But more importantly, the real power was the two state militias who were based in Wilmington. One was the Wilmington Light Infantry, and the other was the Naval Reserves. Now, these were the National Guard of the day, and they reported to the Republican governor in Raleigh, where they were supposed to. In reality, they were commanded by white supremacists and made up entirely of white supremacists. So they took, in fact, the commanders of both of these militia were the leaders of the white supremacy movement in Wilmington. So they basically had an armed militia at their disposal. They were worried that the militia didn't have enough firepower because Wilmington was 56% black, and they didn't think they could control the black majority, even though black men had very, very few guns because the white gun merchants would not sell to blacks. But they decided they needed what they at the time was called rapid fire guns. These were essentially the first machine guns. They brought them a Colt and a Hotchkiss. These were very expensive, very powerful weapons. And each militia was supplied with one of these, and they put it on the back of a horse cart. And they came into use, and they were very effective on the day of the coup. The most interesting part of this is 1898 was the summer of the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, and the two white units were called up for federal duty, but the white supremacists made sure they were back in Wilmington by the date of the coup and for the election, which was November 8th and November 10th of 1898. And at the time that they rose up and began killing black men on the street, they were still federal soldiers. They weren't mustered out for a couple of weeks later. So you had federal soldiers murdering black civilians. Now, at the same time, Wilmington sent two colored units, so-called colored units, to the Spanish-American War in 1898. But the white supremacists made sure that they were stuck out on a training base in Georgia on the day of the coup. So they were not available. And that was the only firepower that the black community had, was these young, trained black soldiers who had weapons, but of course they weren't in town. That left them with very few weapons. There were some of the colored brigade soldiers from the colored brigades in the Civil War who still had some of their older weapons, and they had a few shotguns, but they could not come near the firepower that individuals whites had, that the red shirts had, and that the two militias had. So it was by no means a fair fight, and that's why it was over so quickly, and the coup was accomplished in a matter of hours.
You mentioned that there was a fusion government going on, that there were whites that got together with the blacks and helped some of the black men into the alderman positions. And I think the sheriff had some black employees. What happened to those people after the coup?
They were targeted, and they were some of the main targets. The aldermen and the black policemen were fired just before the coup. They intimidated the white government into firing the black officers, telling them, well, maybe there won't be violence on election day and afterwards if you'll just fire these officers. They did, but of course there was violence. But they were very effective in intimidating black men. One thing I didn't mention earlier was the intimidation of black men who were eligible to vote during the spring, summer, and fall. The red shirts rode out into the Cape Fear countryside at night and yanked black men out of their homes and beat them and whipped them and said, if you even dare register the vote, we'll come back and kill you. And that really suppressed the black vote. Also, white merchants told their black employees they would be fired if they registered to vote, and many who did register to vote were fired. So that had a very, really an incredible effect on the black vote on the day of the election, which was one way the white supremacists stole the election. The other way was they literally stuffed Democratic ballots and removed Republican ballots from ballot boxes by creating diversions. The red shirts would break into a polling place and start a small fire in a diversion, and in the confusion, literally stuff the ballot boxes.
Wow. What about the white men that helped those black men into office? Were they targeted as well?
They were targeted as well. There was something called the Banishment Campaign, and there was a committee of white supremacists whose sole job was to select the leading whites and blacks, the most effective and influential, who were to be rounded up the day of the coup, put on trains, and sent out of the state. And in fact, that's what happened. The black men they didn't kill in the streets were rounded up and taken to jail, and so were the white leaders, the so-called white traitors. And in fact, there was as much anger directed toward the so-called white N-word was the word they used for the white leadership. There was as much anger directed at them as it was to black men. All of these people were targeted by the Banishment Campaign, and on the afternoon of the coup, they were rounded up, marched to the train station at gunpoint, put on trains, and said, if you ever come back to Wilmington again, if we see you here, we will shoot you on sight. And not one of them ever came back.
This is not like several other racial uprisings or race riots in the United States history, where at least arguably you could say that the sparking event was an interaction between a black man and a white woman. That
Exactly.
Did not happen here. And yet there is this undercurrent of sexual anxiety, as you referred to. And Josephus Daniels, as you said, is stoking the myth of the black buck looking to rape women. You have this one amazing person whom I had not heard of before, Rebecca Latimer Felton,
Right.
who writes, she seems to be most fascinated with the thing that makes her most afraid. And she writes hysterically, actually, about, I don't mean funnily either. I mean, it's sort of astonishing about, black males endangering the flower of Southern womanhood.
Exactly.
And then what happens is Alex Manley, who is the editor of the biggest black newspaper in the area, takes up these accusations and says, well, if there's sex between black men and white women, it's probably because it's consensual. Now, there is a guy who had some brass whatevers, because that had to be a slap in the face to a lot of people. And I know it wasn't long before the uprising began. We're not rid of this stuff yet.
No.
It's that in itself is an outrage, and just we still see it being enacted. I guess we saw it in Charlottesville. There's so much that's going on there that is very familiar to anybody reading right now.
Oh, there are so many parallels today between what happened then and what happened really since the election of Donald Trump, and specifically January 6th. The events of January 6th are so similar, with the scapegoating and the demonizing of people of color, of a demagogue, in this case, Donald Trump. In 1898, it was a man named Colonel Waddell, who was the leader of the white supremacists. He was a demagogue who was expert at playing on rage and grievance and resentment, and stoking racial hatred, and was extremely successful on the day of the coup. And he didn't have to persuade them, and creating white rage to a fever pitch where they were willing to kill black men in the streets. And with Donald Trump, you had this same sort of scapegoating and demonizing. And I forget the words of his speech before the ransacking of the Capitol, but it was essentially, if you want your country back, you're going to have to fight for it. And it was a similar theme to what it was in 1898. In 1898, the white supremacists were saying, if you want your white way of life, if you want white supremacy to continue, you will have to rise up with your guns and remove this black menace. Well, on January 6th, Donald Trump was saying, if you want your country back, you're going to have to fight for it. And the undertone of that was that the Democrats were bringing people of color into, the replacement theory that you hear so much about on the right, that the threat is that people of color, Muslims, Black Lives Matter movement people, immigrants from Central America are coming to change the very face of America. Your white Christian nation is not going to exist anymore. And that essentially was the message on January 6th, not in so many words, but that was the undertone of Donald Trump's entire campaign. So those are just a few of the parallels. There was also gerrymandering, which we can go into later if you want to talk about it, and voter suppression, which is still going on today in different forms.
We had some visitors over Thanksgiving holiday, and they wanted to go down to Gettysburg. They had never seen. They were from out of state. So I took them to Gettysburg, and we walked around the brand new Gettysburg Visitor Center. And there are a number of films and a number of displays there that make it very clear that one of the prime movers of the Civil War was slavery and the racism that accompanied it. And I was talking to the people, these were people from Michigan, and they were amazed at two things. There were a lot of people in this federal building that walked around without masks.
Yeah.
And second of all, she said, I would be afraid when I was standing next to somebody, just a stranger, and we were reading this thing to say, wasn't that terrible about slavery? Because this person may look at me and say, you're nuts. This wasn't about slavery. This was about the rights of states to do whatever they wanted.
Right.
Which, if you're intimidated in 2021 to say that, as opposed to back in those days, it just seems like not a lot has changed in the ensuing years.
No, what I really shocked me in doing the research for this book is how deep this wellspring of racism runs through American society. And it was very obvious. It was out there in 1898, and people called themselves white supremacists. The use of the N-word was shocking in newspaper editorials and newspaper articles and speeches. Racism was very evident. It was out there. It was a point of pride among whites to be racist. But this undercurrent has survived for more than 120 years, and I think it's been there. It's just a certain segment of the population that is full of rage and resentment against people of color, that their nation is under threat. And Donald Trump really made it okay to be racist, made it patriotic to be racist, and I think he brought out what had been there all this time. This undercurrent of racism that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when he gutted the Voting Rights Act, removed the free clearance part of the act in 2013, essentially said, well, we're in a different society today, and there's really no more racism, and there's no more voter suppression of African Americans, so we don't need pre-clearance. And again, I think Donald Trump revealed that there is this strong undercurrent of racism and white nationalism, and it doesn't take much of a spark to unleash it, as we saw on January 6th.
More with David Zucchino in a moment, but first, this soothing musical Innertube.
You can follow David on Twitter. His handle is @DavidZucchino. That's @DavidZucchino.
As John mentioned, David's been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 4 times. He's won one for the book we're talking about now, Wilmington's Lie. He won the first in 1989 for his Inquirer series, Being Black in South Africa.
He's also the author of the splendid 1997 book, Myth of the Welfare Queen, and the equally fine 2000 book, Thunder Run, The Armored Strike to Capture Baghdad.
And now, back to Don, John, and David Zucchino on the musical Innertube.
So I want to ask you a question. I've been waiting to ask you this question, David. I'd love you to reflect on our propensity to suppress our history. I imagine that your book is making the Wilmington uprising a little bit better known, at least we hope, right?
Right.
But I bet you it's still not very well known in North Carolina. And it seems to me that, we are fighting today in many places in the United States about how to tell our story and what part of the story gets to be told. in our textbooks, in our classrooms, and in our libraries. We're still fighting over that. It just seems to be part of the American way of life that it's a constant battle over who gets to tell the story.
Exactly. And right now in North Carolina, in the legislature, there's a bill that basically focuses on critical race theory, which is not being taught in a North Carolina school, but it's
anywhere
prompted it. And it's in other states as well, run by Republican legislature, essentially defining what history can be taught and defining what history is, what American history is, and what can't be taught. And if that law passed, this book would never be taught. I mean, it would be against the law to teach this kind of book, this kind of history. Of course, this book is not on the curriculum. This subject is not taught in the schools. I quote in the book from some textbooks from the 1940s. Do you have a second for me to read a couple of these quotes to the way the 1898 uprising was referred
Yes,
to?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Please.
Okay. These are public textbooks, state of North Carolina. Let me just read you a couple examples. This is from 1933, public textbook. Quote, "There were many Negro office holders in the eastern part of the state, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feeling between the races." Here's from a 1940 public school textbook. "The mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe." And there are many, many other examples of when, in the few times this was mentioned, this Wilmington event was mentioned, that's the way it was framed.
Why do we do this? Yeah, it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. And
how much of it also is the winner gets to write history?
Exactly. That's
that
what happened in this case. You know, the white supremacists, the first generation, those who took part in the coup, celebrated it. They bragged about it. They wrote memoirs. They wrote books. They wrote newspaper articles. Right after the coup, there was an enormous parade in Wilmington with the red shirts on horseback, firing their Winchesters, going through the black parts of town, terrorizing the black men who had survived. Raleigh had a much bigger celebration organized by Josephus Daniels. All white citizens of the state were given reduced train fares to come to Raleigh. So thousands of people showed up in Raleigh, and it was the same thing with the red shirts on horseback, firing guns, celebrating the return of white supremacy in its proper role. The next generation in Wilmington realized that these truths were a little bit uncomfortable. The massacre of black citizens and this white supremacist group, but they stopped talking about it. They buried it, except for these few references that I quoted in these textbooks. The story was essentially disappeared from history and did not come back into the consciousness of North Carolinians until 1998, when the University of North Carolina at Wilmington tried to take another look at what really happened and tried to correct the historical record. And that's essentially what I wanted to do with this book, is to correct the historical record and frame the events the way they truly happened, which is the opposite of the way it was framed by the victors.
I mean, that's another part of the story that I suppose we should mention, is that these guys got away with it and indeed profited from it in their long political careers that go forward from here, right? And is it Josephus Daniels?
Josephus Daniels.
Yeah, is he the senator for 8 terms or something like that? I can't remember.
That was Furnifold Simmons, who was the chairman, a great name, chairman of the Democratic Party, and he and Daniels were the leaders across the state of the white supremacy campaign, and he was elected to the Senate for 30 years. Josephus Daniels became Secretary of the Navy, ambassador to Mexico. There was a guy named Charles Aycock, who was one of the leading racist speakers, one of the demagogues speaking on the stump. He was elected governor, and in fact, 4 of the main white supremacist speakers during the campaign of 1898 were later elected governor. So it was almost a prerequisite for public office in North Carolina to have been part of the white supremacy campaign. And as you mentioned, it's an important point I forgot to mention earlier, is they completely got away with it. No one was ever held accountable. No one was charged, but no one went to jail. No one was charged. There was a very interesting response from the federal government, who you would expect. It was a Republican president, William McKinley, a Republican administration. You would think they would immediately send troops down and restore order and restore black man's right to vote. Before the coup, there was a delegation of black ministers, as well as a congressman, George Henry White, who was from a district outside Wilmington, from North Carolina, who was the one and only black member of Congress in the House or the Senate. He led a delegation of black ministers. They went to see McKinley about a month before the coup and said, here's what's happening now. They're going to rise up. They're going to steal the election. They're going to kill everybody. They're going to take over Wilmington. McKinley did nothing. After the coup, this same delegation went back. McKinley again did nothing. I could find nothing in the record where McKinley made one public comment about the coup. There were a couple of cabinet meetings where it was discussed, but essentially they did nothing about it, which was interesting because McKinley was an abolitionist. He had been a Union officer. He was elected to office in large part on the strength of black voters.
Yes.
But I think he made this is my supposition because he never wrote about it in his memoirs. I think he made a calculation that this North Carolina coup was so successful, it had eliminated the black man from voting. It was going to spread through the South. So he could not count on black votes because black men would not be voting. He needed to appease the white supremacists. So I think that's why he just absolutely said nothing about it and did nothing about it. And of course, no state official would do anything because the state had been taken over by white supremacists and the city of Wilmington had been taken over by white supremacists. So they certainly weren't going to do anything about it. So these people literally got away with murder, and they got away with the only armed overthrow of an elected government in American history.
Wow. I'm interested in your process too, David. I read the book and it reads very much like you were like a day-to-day account of these people and what they went through personally. It reminded me a lot of Killer Angels, again, a day-to-day account of the Battle of Gettysburg and what these people were feeling and how they were thinking. How did your research get you into the heads of these people who lived so long ago?
Yeah, well, first of all, I approached this as a journalist, not as a historian, because if I'd been a historian, I think I'd written a much different book. I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to write a narrative. And I just put myself back into 1898 as if I were a reporter during that time, trying to find out what had happened, and basically spent a lot of time in libraries. And I have never done a historical book before. The books I've done previously, I was a witness to the events. I took part in the events, or I could interview people who took part in events. Obviously, in this case, I couldn't interview anybody who took place in the events. So every single sentence in that book is backed up by a document, as you see in the documentation in the index. It took a lot of digging, but there were a lot of memoirs. There were a lot of official accounts. The whites in particular, as I said earlier, that first generation was proud of it and wrote a lot of memoirs and letters. But the black men who were running for their lives and fleeing for their lives, some of them even managed to write memoirs and write histories of what happened. So there were many, many personal accounts that allowed me to get into not only what happened, but the motivation of the characters, because they wrote about it in their memoirs or in these accounts. They explained why they did what they did, which was just gold for a writer when you can get inside of the head of the main characters. And fortunately, two of the main characters were Alex Manly and the colonel I mentioned, the Confederate Colonel Waddell, who did write or talk about what had happened and talked about their motivation. And then there were the newspaper articles. They were just hundreds and hundreds, not only from the national press, but from the Wilmington papers were all white supremacist papers, except for Alex Manly's Daily Record, which was the largest black readership paper in the South at the time and the most successful. So there was a lot of evidence, but it took a lot of digging. It took 2.5 years to dig out this story because, as you can imagine, these are disparate pieces of information, and I had to pile them all up and then put them in the right chronological order, which took quite a while, but it did allow me to write a narrative that had characters in it, and it had events that appeared to be happening in real time. The newspapers were particularly valuable And the telegraph was so important at the time. That's how the white supremacists communicated. They also had telephones. A few of the whites in Wilmington had telephones, and that's how they communicated. But they used the telegraph, and all that stuff is on the historical record. The telegraph, all the telegrams remain, and I could use those as sources. And of course, the newspapers and speeches. There's just a wealth of information out there.
You tell this story with admirable restraint. And having spoken with you for more than a half an hour about it, I realized that there was a lot to restrain, but also that the story is told in a way that at many points in your book, the narrator is pretty transparent. That is to say, you see right through the narrator, and you let the events and words speak for themselves in the best possible tradition. But I give you credit for that because like me, like anyone else reading this book, I know some of the things that you've been feeling, and we've been learning a lot more about it here sitting with you.
Yeah, I was angry. I was just outraged. I felt that as I was doing this research, and I did have to take breaks at times because it was so unrelentingly depressing, these events. And of course, I knew what was going to happen, and I could see it slowly build. And it was depressing, but I did not want to tell the reader what to think. The events themselves, the words of the characters were so powerful, I didn't need to interpret them for the reader. All I had to do was just explain what happened and why it happened and why people did certain things, and the reader could draw their own conclusions. I didn't have to tell them they should be outraged or they should be angry. The events and the facts spoke from themselves. So I'm a pretty dispassionate narrator, just relating the tale and letting it take place. Several reviews of the book noted that there's no real sense of outrage from the author, but the events themselves are outrageous enough that it wasn't necessary.
Well, obviously, this was a labor of love to a native North Carolinian.
Right.
And it was terrific. It was a terrific read. And we, as John said, we do recommend it to anybody listening. David, thanks for being with us today and to bring that labor of love here and give us a little explanation about it.
Congratulations, David. Thanks for coming on our show.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks for your interest. Great talking to you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
You can get in touch with us by email. We're at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
You can follow us on Twitter at @MInnertube, capitalize the M and I.
Our webpage is musicalinnertube, that's musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn, that's spelled LIBSYN.com.
The Innertube is available on Amazon Music, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Like us, why don't you? And give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.